Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you more about our French Wars topic. And in this video, we're going to discuss the style of warfare that happened between 1790 and 1815 concerning the use of infantry. As always, you must remember this lesson is catered towards the student level, so our content will provide with some key knowledge and practice our historical skills throughout. So, with all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So yes, as said in my introductory video, there's a big shift in the type of warfare that happens, very different to our modern warfare we've been looking at in our previous series. Now, in the French Wars or Napoleonic era, we find the type of warfare the armies took part in included something called pitched battles, which were large battles in open fields between thousands of soldiers. And less was it about who had the biggest gun or who used machine guns or who used bigger tanks. In this time, there were other key parts of combat, which were infantry, cavalry, and artillery. They sound familiar, they sound similar to what we have today. It's very different back then. So it's very important we discuss that. The battles were quite loud, they were chaotic, they were out in the open, and so keeping the men under command was very essential. But we need to understand what were the parts of war, how exactly did they fight on the battlefield. So we're going to discuss infantry today and the style of war which it contained. Before we go any further, it's important to clarify what exactly we mean by infantry. Now, infantry was containing the majority of the armies who fought in pitched battles in the early 1800s. They fought very closely with one another, typically shoulder to shoulder in the field. They moved as a unit under the commander in charge, unless they were instructed otherwise. The average infantry had a brigade of around 3,000 to 5,000 men, who were then split up into battalions, which accounted for as many as 840 men at their peak. However, the average size of a battalion when actually out moving on campaign was around 500 to 600 men. These men would then be split up into various companies of around 100 men and given their specialist roles within the group. It was very important that every man played his role that he was assigned in order to achieve maximum success in battle. The battalions of infantry were roughly split up into four key groups: the Fusiliers, the Grenadiers, the Skirmishers, and the Reserve Force, more formally called the Reserve Guard, because they marched with the marching band when they moved to a new location. Now I'll give an overview of what exactly the types of infantry were. The first one we'll discuss is the Fusiliers. They were the largest part of the infantry, containing upwards of 300 men, roughly 3 companies were. Their job was to guard the artillery and the command post where the officers were stationed when on the defensive. However, when on the offensive, they would advance and engage the enemy's own Fusiliers. As they were the largest part of the infantry, they were trained in various formations of how to fight, or in lesser trained armies, they were more so bundled together in a mass because they lacked specific training for more specialized roles like the Grenadiers or skirmishers. Given they had such high numbers, it was also important for the officers to rally these men to maintain morale at all times. Typically, the higher one's morale, the better a soldier would fight in combat. The next type of infantry were the Grenadiers. They were a smaller force, containing around 100 to 150 men, or about one full company. They were stereotypically the tallest, strongest, and toughest soldiers, best put forward for fighting in close quarters combat. Consequently, they were the heavy infantry tasked with holding the flanks against enemy attacks to stop them breaking the lines. They typically would be the first to engage enemy cavalry or skirmisher units who were trying to open that flank and breach the position. They would therefore buy valuable time for the infantry to reassess, to prepare, and perhaps even create a defensive formation like a square against the horses. The third type of infantrymen were the skirmishers. Now, these were a smaller force. They were typically smaller men, lightly equipped, but they were fast runners, and typically they were the best trained and most talented shooters in the infantry. They were never more than 100 men, and they were split up into their platoons of around 20 men. For the British, they tended to be equipped with something called a Baker rifle, whereas the Fusiliers had the short best land muskets. The Baker rifles were much better, so they could shoot from much further distances quite accurately, up to around 1,000 yards. Their job was to attack, harass, and distract the enemy position. They would separate from the rest of the infantry and try to flank around the position. And because they were so light, they could do it no matter the terrain, whether hilly, whether smooth, whether flat. They were able to flank the position and cause that key distraction. Because they were smaller in size, they also had more free rein. They could adapt to the land they were facing. For instance, many of them were split up into pairs, and they would have two of them engage a position. It was very common for one to shoot and one to be reloading. So when they were finished shooting, so by the time they finished reloading, the other could then shoot and reload and keep trading off as such. They followed a principle of fire and move, doing their best to take cover and protect themselves against enemy retaliatory fire rather than trying to break the lines and charge the position. Fourth and final type of infantrymen were the rear guards. The rear guard was typically the remaining men who were much younger, more inexperienced, and perhaps just simply not very talented at shooting and reloading the muskets. They contained the marching band, who provided music to inspire the troops in battle and bear the flags of their nation so the soldiers knew where their command post was should they have to retreat, or of course in their long marches in the night, they could of course quickly find their position if they were to fall behind. They were also, because of their rear position, typically closer to the commander of the army, and so they became the last line of defense to protect the commander if the more experienced infantry like the grenadiers and fusiliers were routed and the enemy had successfully broke the position. If victorious, they would typically march forward with their music to inspire cheering and congratulations to their victorious allies. Now, there are four types of infantry: our fusiliers, our grenadiers, skirmishers, and rearguard. But how exactly did they fight? What formations did they form into when they were in combat? Let's consider what those formations actually are. Two very popular and common formations were the mass and line formations. Now, infantry at its simplest level fought in lines. As I said, the fusiliers and grenadiers, they tended to be quite packed together, and therefore they tended to be arranged into lines to fight in various formations. The easiest line to follow was the mass formation. This is where the entire battalion remained close together rather than split into their specialist units. Again, more inexperienced and less specialized units used this method. It was easy to conduct in combat, and also it was difficult to try and master the other formations, especially if one had just got a recently conscripted army who was new to fighting and therefore lacked the speed and precision of a more well-drilled force. As an example, Spanish guerrilla forces during the Peninsular War were typically the ones who used this formation because they rarely fought in pitched battles and lacked the training to do much else. The mass formation relied on more tightly compacted lines that were so close together that they could better form into things like a square formation should they be attacked and have to resist a cavalry charge. However, this meant, by contrast, they were much more vulnerable to artillery fire. You'll understand when we get on to our artillery explanation in our following videos that the artillery had the capability to break through a line, and of course the grape shot and so forth would keep blasting through and would shred through all the men. And so if you were tightly compacted together, you imagine the artillery would strike your position and would rip through most of your platoon and potentially a lot of your company as well. So you were quite vulnerable, and especially if you could lose dozens of men so quickly. So consequently, it was much more common for other types of formations to be used, especially if facing a force that did have access to an artillery battery that could attack in such a devastating manner. And this is why the line formation was much more popular with formally trained forces like those in France and Britain. They're made up of lines of roughly 10 to 30 men, and they were 3 files deep, so an entire line could contain an entire company of men. But as you can see on my screen, I've drawn a diagram of what one full line of infantry may potentially look like, and you imagine just two more of those red lines would be underneath. The soldiers, by doing this, would have access to much more firepower with their muskets. They could engage in something called volley fire, where the first line would shoot, and then the second line, and then the third, so they could constantly put pressure on the enemy opposition. This also proved very effective as a defensive line as well, because you were being attacked by an enemy troop charging at you, then your soldiers could fire back and, of course, hold back the assault as best they could. It was also effective as a defense against artillery because the line is so spread out. If the artillery was firing into one line of position, they would not be able to kill more than a few of the men. It would be very rare for an entire line to be struck. The artillery would have to reposition and flank around, which, given the weight of the artillery and the difficulty of doing that, was very, very uncommon to be done in combat and pulled off successfully against a well-trained force. However, the straightness of these lines was very difficult to maintain, while of course I've laid them out more or less evenly on my screen for you. If you imagine the land you were fighting on was not necessarily flat, there were some jagged parts, if there were holes, if you were on a bit of a mounted terrain or a hill, it was very probable for men to accidentally break away from their formation, and this would therefore weaken their defences. They couldn't compactly protect against each other in their volley fire. And so slow moving was a big thing this formation had to follow. So the officers had to work really hard to drill their men to walk in sync and therefore leave themselves less vulnerable if they were attacked. However, they could also still be vulnerable to cavalry charges because they're having to move so slow to maintain their straight line formation. The cavalry was much quicker and so could flank around, cut off their rear, and break the formation from the other side. To combat this, the Duke of Wellington Wellesley famously changed British formations to only be 2 files deep rather than 3. So whereas the French had 3 files, the British would only have 2. And therefore this would take time away from the cavalry, who would have to engage the infantry earlier than they would typically expect, because of course they're used to fighting against 3-line formations, not 2. And therefore it means it would also be longer, and therefore mean a wider flank to come around, and therefore more time is eaten up trying to take down the position. Another commonly used formation was a column charge or a column of division. This was typically employed when used on the offensive. It was typically 2 columns wide and half lines deep. It was far more flexible than the other formations, allowing for faster movement as the men could march nearer the enemy without worrying about maintaining the straightness of their lines. It also meant when at a distance, it was tougher to judge how many men were actually within this column, because of course you think about how far away you'd be, seeing them coming up or under over a hill. It's tough to gauge. Whereas if there were a wider array of men, you can easily count how many lines there would be. Furthermore, if attacked by cavalry, they could quickly switch to the square formation. As we'll see in a moment, the column formation, being a rectangle by design, is naturally closer to a square than a big line formation was, wider area of space. However, the natural compactness of this column left the men once again more vulnerable to artillery shots. If you imagine the artillery was in front of you and was to take a shot down through the middle, you would probably likely hit at least half of the men. Whereas in a line formation shooting from the other side, it only would hit maybe a third at most. And so it's very important to remember that is that this was a great defense against cavalry, but likewise was a more vulnerable position to be against artillery. All in all, though, the column's aim was to use fast movement to quickly reach the opposing defences. The commanders could then switch the formation to either smash through the enemy's centre or split back again to a line formation to try and charge and breach the position that way. The latter was typically used when the enemy faced a competent defender who was able to resist and use volley fire across their entire line. And the final formation is the square formation. This was a more defensive formation by design, which sacrificed movement to form a much more stationary square. You might be looking at my square I've drawn and thinking it's not quite a full-on square. Well, that's because, of course, again, in combat, it's very difficult to make a perfect square. And so, realistically, a rectangle was what most of our square formations really looked like, with the soldiers all armed and therefore aiming outwards rather than inwards or across. The intent was simple. It was going to serve as a barrier against cavalry charges. When horses would approach it, they would recognize it the same way they would recognize a wall, and rather than running through it, they would kind of sidestep and maybe either stop or try and gallop around it. But because it's a near enough perfect square, it prevented the horsemen from actually breaking through, and therefore made it difficult for them to strike with their swords. As we'll see when we get into my cavalry video, many cavalrymen relied more on their sabres and swords to try and break a position rather than using their muskets. Meaning the infantry could then shoot the horses to topple the men and then easily kill them once they were exposed on the ground. However, once again, the tightness of the square left it very vulnerable to artillery, which could of course kill the entire company in one single blast, given in this formation they would truly be bunched up against one another to maintain an effective volley fire. Furthermore, it was a very weak option if used against an army that was not using much cavalry, and so its application in combat was quite rare. However, when it was used effectively, it could be a thing that could change the entire tide of a war. For instance, when we get onto the Battle of Waterloo, the square formations Wellesley had designed with his men were able to repel an entire cavalry charge, and that indeed changed the battle that occurred that day in the British's favour. But again, we'll say more about that, the Battle of Waterloo, in much greater detail in a later video in this series. The last thing to note, though, is that despite all these formations, the best armies were the ones who could mix the formations in battle. Mastery of this transition was key for success in any form of combat. It was very important for a well-trained infantry to be able to transition from a column formation to advancing, to a line formation when attacking, or even when on the defensive into a square formation to protect themselves against cavalry. So understanding each formation and being able to quickly switch into them was so important if an army was going to have major success in these pitched battles they were having throughout the late 18th and early 19th century. And the final thing to outline are the various methods of combat that the infantry would engage in during this era. Now, the infantry relied on three major methods. They were volley fire, solo fire, and charging attacks, typically with a bayonet. Volley fire was the most common method, practiced by many fusiliers and even grenadiers in the line formation. They would fire their muskets in unison, with each in their ranked orders. So the first line fired, then line 2, then line 3. So use massive firepower from the simultaneous shooting to strike down the enemy position. The shots were very effective when close to the enemy, whether on the attack or allowing the enemy to advance and reach their position really close to defend against a charge. However, it was therefore very important the men fired in sync with one another, because if they did not, the firepower was weaker and would not be very effective, especially because, again, in the Fusiliers, these were not the marksmen of the company, so therefore they would struggle sometimes to shoot, even from a relatively near distance. So it's very important they waited till the enemy position was right on top of them, and they could fire in sync with one another to take down the enemy's line. It also is worth noting that the best muskets had a much lower rate of fire, unlike the Baker rifles, who could theoretically fire up to 6 to 8 rounds a minute. Most Fusiliers were only able to fire up to 2 to 3 shots a minute, because again, that's just too slow to reload. So the poor rate of fire made shooting as a group in unison so important for volley fire to succeed and ensure they could stop the enemy attacks and also break enemy lines. The other style of fire was solo or single fire. It was the least common used at this point in war, but it was mostly used by the skirmishers. While fire and move is a common tactic today and breaking up into smaller units is quite effective, back then skirmishers were a much smaller part of the fighting force, because their role was to harass the enemy rather than overpower them. And single shots were a brilliant way to do that, especially because they could fire from a distance. Because these were the marksmen who were the best at shooting over a long range, they therefore could surprise the enemy, shoot from a distance, take cover, confuse the enemy, because they would have no idea where they'd been shot from. And if they did know, they would have to separate and try and advance in the position because they couldn't shoot as accurately as the skirmishers were. Furthermore, as said earlier, when in this kind of skirmish, the platoons would break off into their pairs so one could fire and the other reload. They were also instructed by their officers to try to target a specific part of the formation. For instance, they would really try and aim for where any officers were and strike down the officer. Because again, if you took out an officer, the enemy would have no idea what their next action was and probably would have a massive morale drop to lose that guidance and leadership, especially the inexperienced soldiers, while in combat. And the third form of combat is the charge, specifically the bayonet charge. And this was carried out by the army when they were really close to the enemy position and were aiming to break their lines. They would fix bayonets. A bayonet was adapted to attach to the tip of the rifle. You may remember this from my First World War series. They would then charge right at the enemy. While highly dangerous for the attacker, since the enemy line could just simply volley fire into the advancing men, the charge was highly effective from a psychological perspective. Just imagine it, the sight of hundreds of shouting soldiers racing at your line, and this would cause many to flee in absolute fear. Therefore, ensuring your own men held high morale as they charged, and faith their charge would break the line was so important to ensure the attack kept going. But likewise, if the enemy on the defensive held their nerve, they could then trust that they could hold back the attack by using their volley fire, and therefore ensure the defensive line would not fail. The charge therefore became less successful as wars progressed, and therefore it found itself devolving less into a precise charge, but more into a chaotic hand-to-hand brawl breaking out in the middle of many fields, void of strategy, and more reliant on whichever soldiers managed to survive this massive brawl. Napoleon famously revived its use one last time at Waterloo when on a desperate charge with his infamous Old Guard to try and win the offensive. As I said earlier with our square formation, I'll delve into more of that in a later video. And there we are. That's our outline and background information into the infantry style of warfare during this French War era. I hope you found it quite useful and quite insightful. Do remember, as always, to subscribe and comment below the thing you found most fascinating that you've learned in this video. And of course, check out some wider reading as well. I will have included below for you to check out. We'll of course go into the cavalry and artillery into our following videos to learn more about them and how they're used in this style of warfare, and also naval war as well. We can't be forgetting that, so we'll be delving into some more detail with them in our future videos. With all that said, thank you as always for watching. This has been History with Sire, and thank you for listening.